Hey everyone, thanks for joining us today. I'm Andrea. I am product specialist here at ProdPad, and with us today is Dave Martin, founder at Right to Left. So Dave is going to start in a minute, but before we get going, just to let you guys know, we have some polls, we have some questions. We will be doing a Q&A at the end. So if you do have anything that you'd like to ask our speaker, you can drop it in there. So this is a place for you, a time for you to get engaged with Dave and myself. So I think with that said, we can get started. Dave, the floor is yours.
It says I'm muted.
I think I've just unmuted you.
Great. Thanks very much,
Technical
Andrea.
issues, no worries.
And thanks, ProdPad, for inviting me to do this. And thanks, everybody, for turning up. Just apologies now. I've got a bit of a cold, so apologies if I sound a little congested, and hopefully I won't be coughing. But if I do, apologise now. So let's get started. I work for a company called Right to Left, and we do product training. Just wanted to give you a quick background to me, so to give you an idea of why you should listen to anything I might be saying. And if you disagree with anything, that's awesome. Please do put it in the Q&A and we can talk about it either live or offline. Debate is fantastic. But I've worked for a bunch of companies, always leading product and software development, typically online web development, web apps of some sort, or mobile. I'd really like to find out who you are before we go too far though. And Andrew, I think we have a poll for everybody to tick a button on. So it'd be great if you could fill that in for me, guys.
Yeah,
It's
I've
pretty.
just launched it, and people are answering.
Awesome. I just need to quit the presentation for a second so I can get rid of the poll and see it.
I can always read it back to you. So we have 48%. Sorry, let's start from the top. 27% startups, 48%, 50% now, medium-sized business, and 24% enterprise.
Fantastic. Thank you, everybody, for doing that. That really helps me when I talk, so I can try and make sure I cover something for everybody. That's really useful. So this conversation today is going to be about growth and some tips to some observations that I've made of what common mistakes are and how to overcome them, so that we can improve our probability of creating growth for our product lines. And that kind of fits for everybody, no matter which bucket you're in. But obviously, the startup and the medium-sized businesses are probably those that have a higher growth target potentially, and are looking for more significant year-on-year growth. So we'll try and tailor the discussion to fit accordingly. But just to help me out, how do you measure growth? What do you see growth as? And to answer that, maybe you can just, maybe a few of you, people who feel comfy, can put something in the chat window in Zoom so that we can see that. And just give me your feedback. So how would you measure growth? What would it be? How do you know you're growing? What do you look at? Fantastic, we've got one reply already, that's great. So this person's saying increased monthly active users, MAUs, monthly active users. That's really cool. Somebody else is saying increased ARR. So for everybody, in case you don't know, that's annual recurring revenue. Probably a subscription business there. It depends on the biz objectives, somebody else has said. It depends on the user, probably counting users, revenue, market share. Somebody else has mentioned peer recruitment and retention. So this is great. We've got some we can measure growth in a number of different ways. So somebody else has just mentioned the number of happier customers. So maybe we might measure that with NPS. So we're capturing, you're all viewing growth as seeing some metric to go up. And that metric is either pure revenue, or it's something that, an assumption of something that you believe that when it goes up, revenue will eventually go up, because at the end of the day, we're a business. So increased retention, increased revenue, etc. will all drive that up. Oh, someone's just mentioned, will I share the slides? Of course I will, no problem whatsoever. I'll put them on slide share and I'm sure Andrea can send the link.
We will also be sending a recording of this next week, so don't worry, you will get a copy.
Oh, great, fantastic. So we're all viewing growth the same thing, whether we're looking at the hard data of the actual financial number or we're looking at the things we assume drive growth. We're all in the same position. Let me just close that chat window, which is great. I personally pretty much like to think of it as depending at the level, typically I'm used to working at C-suite level, so I'm really focused normally on profit for an established business, or for a younger business like startup, then it's typically about the user adoption and how a number of customers rather than pure revenue, depending at the stage you're at. And I'm very sure that enterprise care about profit. So it's really great to see we're all on the same page. It's my belief, and I'm sure a few of you will agree with me, that if you're a high tech, if you want to be a growth company and you're a tech company, the only way to win out there is innovate. You've got to innovate your way to success. There are three kinds of businesses in my mind, and you'll all know which one you fit in. This depends. This is where if you put the most investment in the one area, this is what's going to drive your growth. And it's either you're a marketing business, you're a services business, or you're a product business. And tech companies are typically product businesses. Sometimes they're not, but nearly 9 times out of 10, they're product businesses. So it's the product differentiation, and it's how they wow their customers. It's going to drive those MAUs, drive that recursive revenue, and drive the high levels of revenue and profit at the end of the day. And to do that requires to do something different to somebody else, and that's innovation. Whether it's incremental innovation, where we're trying to do little things slightly better, or whether it's very disruptive innovation and we're trying to completely change how an entire sector goes about its business. It's still innovation. So if we understand what growth is and we understand what we have to do to get it, why don't all products enjoy sensational growth? Why aren't they all flying off the shelves and all our numbers are going upwards in the right direction? That's a tricky question, and the answer is obviously many different things, because there's so many parameters depending on market, business, staff, talent, lots and lots of different things. But for today, we're going to talk about one area, focus on the product challenges of how product impacts growth. And I'm specifically going to focus on decision making, because we make, as product managers, we have to make a lot of decisions every day. And as a business choosing how to invest its funds, there's big decisions being made. And these decisions from my observation as a coach and a consultant, I've frequently seen companies with great staff and great talent and people with brilliant process and lots of things you would expect there, all and pretty impressive. Yeah, they're still failing. And when you lift the lid and look in, you find out that where they're failing is they're making decisions poorly. So we'll talk about that today. So the first decision-making topic that is critical for product managers is prioritizing. And for whatever reason, we frequently see that prioritization is really being done poorly. And there are a few common mistakes to share with you on this space. There is so regularly that the user is being ignored, and instead we've taken all of our tasks of what we need to do to build something, all the outputs, instead of thinking about the outcomes. We've taken all the outputs and we've managed to come up with an effort for them and an impact or a return they might create, and then we prioritize them with some sort of basic ROI formula, i.e. if it's higher impact and low effort, we ought to do this thing first, which in one way isn't necessarily a negative at all. There's nothing wrong with having that view on the world, but on its own it becomes really dangerous, because on its own it means you forget completely about the customer experience, you forget completely about the customer expectations, you forget about that differentiation, And you forget about the heuristic journey, that the actual, the journey that the customer is experiencing and how they use your tools and software. And a particular feature that might be viewed as very valuable may require something that's viewed as not valuable. It might be a dependency to make that thing work, to make it deliver the value to the customer. So we see too much of prioritization being purely mathematics and spreadsheet driven, without adding on the layer. You do need that, but without augmenting the layer of the heuristic journey and experience. And probably my favorite tool to use to augment the maths view of prioritization is using Jeff Patton's user story map. If you haven't seen the user story map, we won't go into how to use it right now, but please go check it out. Jeff's got a great book, User Story Mapping, which covers it very easily. It's really nicely written and explains how to build this. And what's critical about the user story mapping is it provides that clear heuristic journey. So you recognize what experiences and what the user flow will be if you deprioritize or prioritize something. And used well, the user story map can become a version of your roadmap. So prioritizing poorly is number one issue. Let's see if this video plays. Here we go. There's some pictures of cows on the screen. We're online. It probably should be cats, but it's cows. Did you see that every single cow there jumped over the white line? It's really quite bizarre. There's no reason. There's no hole. There's no spike. There's no good reason to jump over that white line at all. But they all did, every single one of them. And this is a great example of collection belief or collective belief. Collective belief, this is the bias and the problem when you have a group of people and one person shouts out loudest and says, hey, this thing really positively and with plenty of passion and commitment, this thing is important, we should do it. This line is dangerous, we should jump over it. And whether or not the room necessarily agrees independently, it's easier to agree with the person than it is to disagree. And you see this slightly less in startups with a great culture when they're small. When they get a bit bigger, it changes. You see this a lot in medium-sized business and enterprise. So there's a good 78% of you who see this on a daily basis. You spend lots of time in rooms with meetings, trying to make some decisions and create value. And it's easier to agree with everybody else than it is to disagree. The political kudos that's carried with disagreeing and sticking your neck out and those risks makes it hard to say no. It makes it easier to say yes. And I've definitely been in meetings and witnessed C-suite meetings where the room has agreed to do something, quite often quite significant. And then in the elevator, there's two people from the meeting talking, saying how they think it's the wrong thing to do. And as a coach, I'm standing there listening, going, well, why didn't you say that in the meeting? Because clearly we've just made the wrong decision. And this happens again and again. So, there's no golden, silver bullet to fix this, other than being aware of it. And if you're running meetings, and often as product managers you are, to ensure that you're facilitating that meeting in a fashion that collects everybody's thoughts and gets everybody's inputs. It's a bit like when if we run a session, facilitate a session with some form of brainstorming or some sort of evaluation, doing some work that's written down on Post-its to be stuck on the wall in silence ensures that everybody is forced to say what they think without being influenced by each other. So it's really important to think about how to ensure the room is all being represented, and how to manage those people that are the loudest and noisiest, and how to, if you're in a position of facilitation, being able to challenge those people personally, making it safe for everybody else to challenge them, even if you agree with them. That's not a problem. You have to play devil's advocate at times to give a safe space for the rest of the room to disagree. if you're familiar with with the previous one with collective confirmation, then you'll be very familiar with, sorry, I got tongue twisted then. If you're familiar with collective belief, then you might be familiar with confirmation bias. And confirmation bias is a serious problem for product managers who are running experiments. So if you're, like I am, a lean advocate and like to design hypotheses, take assumptions, design hypotheses and experiments to test those hypotheses to make some good data-driven, data-informed decisions and try and get the right problem market or product market fit, then you're going to be at risk of confirmation bias quite a lot. Every discovery phase is at risk of this. Maybe the best example is if you've ever watched The Apprentice on TV. Every series, The Apprentice has some stage where one episode where they've got to design some sort of product, and then they've been set up with a bunch of people from the target audience, and they show it them as market research, and they get feedback from it, and then they go away and do something. And nearly always, and I remember one particularly well where it was something to do with a pram, and they had all these mothers there, and they show all the mothers the product, and all the mothers say, no, we wouldn't buy this thing. This doesn't solve the problem for us. And then they walk out of the meeting room into the street on the TV show, and they're jumping up and down like they do over the moon that their market loves their product. And as an observer watching it on TV, we're sitting there going, why? What happened? Did we see something different? No, it might just be good editing to make the show entertaining. But this happens all the time. We frequently get data and look for our answers to confirm what we want rather than to prove ourselves wrong. Another example of it is as a product manager, when you're designing products, designing experiments, you'll typically look to design the experiment with a success criteria. But if you switch that and design the experiment with a failure criteria, it helps you avoid confirmation bias. I've watched loads of teams who've said our success criteria is 25% of people do X, Y, Z. And they go away and do the experimentation. And then they come back and go, oh, only 20% did it. And I ask the question, well, what are you going to do? Are you going to double down? Are you going to kill the idea? Or are you going to change the idea and pivot? What are you going to do? And that sort of metric, nearly always the answer is, oh, it's close enough to pass. We're going to go ahead and do it. Where if you switch it and say our failure criteria is less than 25%, for some reason, it doesn't make too much sense. It's psychology, it doesn't make too much logical sense on the surface. And for some reason, if it's a failure criteria, when those people hit the same 20% result, instead of arguing it up, they accept it's below the number and decide that's the wrong thing to do. So we see it all the time. Another way to look at it is is how you design your experiment. And do you design your experiment immediately with confirmation bias in the experiment design? And one example of that is if you can imagine four cards, and one side of the card is a number and the other side is a letter. If you imagine there's four of those cards we can see four of them. The first one's got we can see an E, the second one's a 3, then an L, and then a 4. And the test here is the assumption, the hypothesis is that an even card, a card with an even number, has a vowel on the back of it. So which card do you turn over if you can only turn over one card? And nearly always the answer is, oh, well, I'll turn over the even number, the 4, or I'll turn over the E. In other words, we design the experiment to look for a confirmation we're right, where a better experiment would have been to say, I'll turn over the constant, or I'll turn over the odd number and look to prove my assumption wrong. So we should be looking more and more to design our experimentations to prove them wrong, not prove them right. So we don't have confirmation bias either in our interpretation of the results or in the actual design of the experiment in the first place. Status quo bias. Status quo bias is that too familiar feeling of, well, this is the way we've always done it, so we'll just keep doing it this way. And when change or an alternative approach is suggested, we immediately have that defensive feeling that, well, this is the way we've always done it. Why should we change? It's worked. It's always worked, hasn't it? And we have to enter into a debate of whether it has always worked or not to be able to prove everybody that it's wrong. Status quo bias is really a challenge, less in startup, more in medium-sized enterprise. And this status quo bias, along with collective belief, frequently makes decision-making meetings a waste of time. You've got one person who's suffering status quo bias, and they're doing it loudly and then dragging everybody else along with collective belief, we end up just not making good decisions whatsoever. And it's these decisions that impede our ability to grow our products because we're making the wrong ones. So again, it's about thinking about how we can prepare for this. If we know we're looking to change something and change something significantly of the way we've done something for a long while, we need to warm people up to the different way of doing it before the decision. We need to inform people. We need to make sure we have the right stats to help overcome it. And we need to encourage our teams and audiences in the room to understand that this problem exists and warn them of the faults of going this direction before we start the session. So the fifth one, so there were five, and then we're going to talk about a couple of solutions to these. The fifth one is output-driven leadership killing all innovation. And depending on your role, sometimes it feels like it's impossible for you to impact this because you might not be the leader. But you lead as a product manager, you are always in a leadership role of some description, even if it's not got a job title that begins with C. You still have a impact, and you've got an engineering team that you're leading in some fashion, not necessarily from a technical perspective, but from a what we're going to build and what's the problem perspective. Everybody looks to you regularly for answers. And if you over obsess about output rather than outcome, you immediately prevent innovation from happening. The problem with output focus is it determines the solution at the very beginning. In fact, my company's name is named specifically around this problem. We deal with non-deterministic problems every day. So we can't plan what we're going to do left to right in the traditional manner. We have to think about it differently. We have to think about the outcome first and plan backwards to tradition, i.e. right to left. And that's critical for us to always remain focused on the outcome rather than the output. If we want our teams, our engineers, and our UX designers, and everybody else involved, we want them to have the autonomy to be able to solve problems and come up with better ways of doing things to deliver value for our customer. And if we're focused on that through outcomes, where we're saying this is the outcome for the customer we're trying to achieve with this feature, we then provide a framework where people have the opportunity to change the feature and change how the solution might work in order to achieve the same outcome. And that different approach might be that it's cheaper for us. It might be that it's phenomenally disruptive for the customer and much easier for them and really a wow factor. But we'll never find those things if we focus on we want to build feature X, it looks like this. In the same way, as a product manager, if we focus on outputs, it means what do we celebrate? What's success? Well, success is hitting release and shipping code. And shipping code is important and needs to happen with high cadence, but it doesn't create, on its own, it doesn't create a business outcome or a customer outcome. It's the outcome from the outputs that we care about. So we must always look to not celebrate the release, but celebrate the outcome the release created. We need to rethink how we motivate ourselves and our teams, and add another line on the Kanban board to do with reviewing the outcome. And at that point, we can then celebrate. Did it achieve what we thought it would achieve? Did it move the metric the way we thought we'd move the metric? Because if it didn't, then it was a complete waste of time and money. And if we don't realize we're wasting time and don't realize we're building the wrong things, then you haven't got a good enough feedback loop to go back and do a better job next time and iterate. Output doesn't really provide space for iteration. And lots of companies, loads of people I speak to say to me, oh, we know we need to iterate, but we never get around to it. We build feature X and then we move on to feature Y. And that's because they're output driven. So how can you improve your odds? We've talked about 5 very common problems that I'm certain that all of you have experienced at least 1 or 2 of them, if not all of them. How do we improve that? How do we overcome it? So very quickly, because we haven't got all day, I will try and cover 2 different approaches to help you to rethink this and to improve how you go about things. The first is really focusing on what outcome-driven leadership is, and we'll go through that pretty quickly, especially given the makeup of the businesses you're in. We'll go through that fast, and then we'll go through lean evidence-based decisions in a way you probably haven't seen it before, focused on value creation. Oh, we'll do it the other way around then. Lean evidence-based first, sorry. I didn't realize they were in that order. So there's 2 numbers there. Number 57 we'll start with. 57 is the number of years ago, 57 years ago, that a gentleman called Everett Rogers wrote a pretty groundbreaking paper called The Theory of Diffusion. And that paper impacts all of us today and how we think about growth. The theory of diffusion was the first time anybody, he was an economist, was the first time anybody had detailed the product life cycle curve of growth, which hopefully you're all familiar with. And he initially studied it based on the adoption of combustion engine tractors instead of horse and cart. That's where it originally came from, but it fits everything. It fits everything we do today. Now we normally see this as a curve that goes up and then back down, but we're going to look at it slightly differently for this. Instead of the normal way, we're going to look at just the create, launch, and adoption part of the life cycle, which is mapped across the x-axis in time, and on the y-axis, to represent growth, we're going to say active customers, but you could view that as revenue, as profit, as anything you want, but I think for this, active customers is best. To achieve that growth, we have to create awareness, we have to get first use, and then we have to get repeat use. And only with those 3 things are we going to see that adoption curve start to grow. Unfortunately, a large number of businesses don't follow the black line, they follow this blue line. In fact, according to Harvard Business Review, and this is a scary figure for you startup companies, according to Harvard Business Review, 19 out of 20 businesses, new products fail. I guess those will also include new products in enterprise, but 19 out of 20 new products fail, according to those guys. So I'm not going to debate whether that number is accurate or not. What we can all agree on is your chances of success with new product development is against you. It's low. And one of the problems is that you achieve limited growth, which we would typically describe today as we haven't achieved product market fit. Back in 1991, Geoffrey Moore described it as crossing the chasm and drew it slightly differently. And in his book, Crossing the Chasm, he talks about early adopters and the fact that we managed to obtain early adopter customers. So our active customers are going up, but we don't get past the early adopters. We don't get to the early mainstream or the full mainstream customers, and we never get onto the laggards. Instead, we've just got the early adopters, and as they peak out, they max which is why our growth feels good to start with, but then over time doesn't continue in the pace we want and pittles off. Now, we've known this since 1991, when we've known about this curve for 57 years, but we're still regularly struggling and regularly not delivering new product development with success, hence the 19 out of 20. So why might that be? And obviously there's a bunch of reasons, but given the topic about bias, etc. earlier on, let's focus on one particular area where this is a potential problem. And to do that, we need to know about a gentleman called Daniel Kahneman. Daniel wrote a paper, which won him a Nobel Prize. And it was called the main part of the paper is about gains and losses. And the paper was popularized in a more modern book called The Chimp Paradox, which you might have read. And the key thing about this is that it describes how much as humans that we don't make logical decisions. We like to think we're very rational and we make rational decisions, but we don't. Instead, we massively value loss compared to gains. So if you lost £100 on the way home tonight, you would feel far more unhappy about this than if you found £100 in the street. We bias massively in our decision making, and it's estimated that it's roughly 10 times more. We feel the pain of loss 10 times more than we feel the equivalent gain. And if we know that and understand that, it's clear that that's going to impact our decision making and has an impact with those biases and changes how we think about things and what we think is attractive. If we focus on the losses, we don't want to take risk. Innovation becomes more difficult. Investment on ideas that aren't very well proven becomes scarier. Pretty much all of our decision making means that we can double down on the wrong things. So we have to find a way to overcome that. And that's where the lean process or the test and learn or whatever name you want to give it, but the lean approach where we're iterating very small iterations. You can use the word MVP if you like that word, but we're iterating on small experiments rapidly throughout the product life cycle, not just at the beginning of the product life cycle, but throughout the product life cycle. And as long as if we can achieve that and iterate rapidly and with evidence, with a clear hypothesis and with data, we then give ourselves more chance to avoid these biases. We give ourselves more chance not to double down on the wrong thing. The second we let those iterations get wide, or we decide to skip a few and just make the decision, the quicker we end up in a place where we're going to make the wrong decision and therefore not see the growth we want to achieve. And i.e., we're not deciding on growth. We're deciding on protecting our losses. And there's loads of examples to demonstrate this kind of thing. Some major, well-known, and it doesn't matter if you have an ace team with phenomenal people. Everybody can fall foul of this. If you look at Segway, I'm sure you might all know who Segway are. The stand-on two-wheeled devices that US president managed to fall off. If we remember the Segway, their initial investment case and forecast was to sell 100,000 units in 18 months, in the first 18 months. And on their board, helping make big decisions, is Jeff Bezos and Steve Jobs at the time. So some heavyweight people who we would view as being great business people and being good product people. But they still failed to achieve their goals massively. In fact, they managed to sell 6,000 in that 18 months instead, which led to pretty much a reshape of the business and it not achieving any of the targets or goals that it initially set out to. to be something very different today than what it set out to be. And now there's lots of reasons why it might have failed, and there's loads of other examples. But one reason that's common every time is they doubled down on the wrong thing. At some point, there was a discussion in a board meeting or with a product manager looking at the line, and it looked like this blue line. And for some reason, there was belief that if they carried on doing the things they were already doing, it would somehow magically, that blue line would U-turn and become where the black line is. Instead of taking a test and learn approach and recognizing where things go, seeing that things are going downwards, recognizing it's not working, and then changing their direction, changing how they're going to do it. And it's that test and learn, frequent experimentation that will avoid following the blue line. Hopefully that resonates and can be helpful to you. What I'm not trying to do is teach you how to do lean experimentation or test and learn. My assumption is that you've probably read the books and know what you're doing there. And if not, we can help you with that. My aim here is to empower you with a tool and a different way of looking at it, to either encourage yourself to do it and realize you do need to do this, or to give you the information you need to help your team or your managers or your leadership support you with taking that approach. Because so often when we coach teams, we go in and we immediately do sort of retrospective and a self-evaluation, and teams know all this stuff, they know how to do it. And then I said, well, why aren't you doing it then? And then comes the truth and a bunch of reasons. And it's nearly always we don't have time, or we don't believe it's worth, which basically means I don't think it's worth doing, or it's our managers won't let us. This graph here, this picture is trying to help you recognize you always have time to do it. You don't have time not to do it, not unless you want to follow the blue line. And this gives you a different way of communicating it up the chain to management who may not understand product development, helping them understand in a way that feels less product specific and talks about the emotions and decision making, which everybody understands. Let's move quickly on to outcome driven leadership and what I mean by that. So we have a picture here of some leaders, some sort of management, some leaders of some description, a product dev team, they're looking happy, and a problem space. And those little dots are representing the thousands of target customers or millions of target customers within that problem space. And we've just got a reminder of that 19 out of 20 at the bottom. So if we're outcome focused, we'll think about that first to make sure you understand what I mean. Quite often, leadership or management are going to tell you what the output is, what output they want. We think we need feature X. We think customers need feature Y. And there's loads of reasons they might think that. Customers might have told them, which doesn't mean it's the right thing to build. It might be their idea. Their competitors might be doing it. A guy they're talking at their business club might have told them how much money they just sold their company and this feature X was important in the sales process. There's a bunch of reasons why people believe that their idea needs to be built. But if we're just going to take the idea straight from leadership down, we're gambling with the idea in reality. We don't actually know it's the right thing. And the product team will then prioritize that. And excuse me. And because it's a output, they haven't got very much leeway to experiment. They haven't got very much autonomy to use their mastery of their product capabilities. So they're really stuck with just looking at the feature costs and the benefits. Sorry for coughing. I hope it doesn't hurt anyone's ears with headphones on. I couldn't get to the mute button, sorry. So they're looking at the feature costs. They're looking at that ROI metric. And then they release the thing on their website. We release these features or this new product or whatever it is. And unfortunately, it misses the problem. The problem space is to the right, and we've missed it. And that results in neglected customers and low retention, and products failing. Now, it might be a new product, and we might sell a bunch of them because our salespeople are brilliant salespeople, and our marketing people are amazing, and we've convinced a bunch of people to buy this. Often that happens, but then year 2 doesn't look quite so rosy, or even 3 months later, because there's no retention. Customers aren't buying it again, because once they've bought it once and realize they don't need it, it would require incredible salesmanship to convince me to buy it again. So that's generally what happens with an output approach. If we switch and think about an outcome approach, leadership sets a direction, a clear outcome they want to achieve for the customer and for the business, ideally both. The product team get to leap on this outcome and go and experiment and test with users and go through the typical experiment, measure, learn cycle to find out what might be a problem market fit. They get the autonomy to play and experiment because the feature to achieve the outcome could be many different ways. It also means they get to throw away ideas when they learn they're wrong. They get to deliver the feature, and now the .com is right inside the problem space, not outside the problem space, which obviously results in delighted customers, assuming everything else in the company is operating properly, like client services, implementation, customer support, and that sales are actually selling what the product does. Assuming everything is good elsewhere, we now can be successful. So we have to be outcome-based focused. We cannot allow things to run from an output approach. It will not work in a repeatable way. It might work once or twice. You might be lucky, or the lead, whoever came up with the output to build, might have been very close to problem space at some point in their career and understands it and gets it right. But very quickly, that will deteriorate. It's not repeatable. You cannot achieve repeatable success following the blue line. So just to finish up, we have a assessment toolkit to help you with your team and personal development, which is free. We focus around these problem spaces. We focus on 3 disciplines that makes up product management. That's learning, collaboration, and prioritization. Everything we've talked about today is typically in all 3, apart from prioritization. That's obviously only in the 1, but the biases come into all of them. And we've developed a assessment of product capability, product manager capability, based on those 3 areas. I'm not going to go through all this. I'll skip it and just get to the end for you, so there's time for questions. This was my padding in case I talk too slowly, talk too fast. So if you're interested, you can go to toolkit.right2left.co.uk and answer 22 very simple assessment criteria questions. The questions are all a number rating, so you just have to click a number for each one. And then you get a report, and that report should help you look at your own teams and own personal development to improve what you do to help you find the gaps so that you can identify a new target condition and help you be the best you can be. So hopefully that's useful for you. I shall skip this as well, because that feels a bit salesy. And then we've got time for any Q&A if there is any.
Yeah, we do. We've got one right now, but guys, don't be shy. Drop in your questions. So the first one that we have is, can you provide a brief example of how to incorporate the user experience into our prioritizing ROI? I see user experience always tacked on as valuable, but unable to be quantified. So it ends up as an afterthought.
Great, lovely question. Thank you for whoever asked that. That's brilliant. I think user experience, excuse me, user experience has to be part of the process from the beginning. Ideally, your user experience staff, any product designers you've got, are involved in the experiment learning process with you and are involved in early discovery. So they aren't firstly, you make sure that the function isn't an afterthought. You make sure the function is involved throughout the process. That's pretty critical. When it comes to pure prioritization, if you've done discovery work on your own product or on a competitor's product before you've launched, and you've watched users go through the flow and you've identified problems in their experience, whether that be they get stuck, some stuff is slow, they have to go through, you basically need to find the problems that user experience will solve. Basically, if you're going to improve the experience and make it the best you can make it, what that really means is you're solving problems to use the product and to create value quicker for the consumer and easier. So you've got to quantify that for prioritization. It has to come back down to what problem is it solving? What's the outcome you're trying to create by improving the experience, rather than the output of, we think we need some UX, we think we could do with improving this. If we focus on what the outcome is, UX is the solution to that. And if UX are involved from day one and you're paired up, teams I ran in the past, we would typically pair a product manager and a designer together, and they'd go through the life cycle together. So they both, did interviews together, etc., so that, because they view the results, they interpret the results differently. A UXer will interpret results completely. You're looking for viability and they're looking for usability. So I hope outcome, to summarize that, sorry I rambled a little, to summarize that, make sure UX and design is involved in the process properly, completely and utterly. Make sure you're focusing on the outcomes you're trying to create, that UX is a solution. So if you can see there's a fault with UX, then work out what the outcome is that fixing it will be. Because if it's just, there are times where good enough is okay, and we could make it much better, but not actually change any real outcome really for anybody. And there are times where that is clearly not the case. So you need to identify what the outcome is. Often, if you're stuck for how to do that, often it will be reducing support calls, increasing adoption levels, improving customer usage, that how often they use the product, which if you've got cohort analysis, you'd be able to identify and prove that changing an element of UX created that value, which is pretty important. So there's some ideas for you. Hope that helps.
Cool. So while we wait for hopefully another question or two pop through, someone's just asked if you can go back one slide so they can write down the assessment kit URL.
So let me find it again and tell you it while I find it. It's Toolkit, all one word, right to left, all letters, no word, no numbers, right to left.co.uk, and it's there at the bottom corner.
Fantastic, thank you. Does anyone have any questions? I know we're almost running out of time, but if any, oh, there we go, one Q&A. Oh, someone just said thank you very much for your answer. The response to the user experience question was extremely helpful.
Oh, great.
I think this entire webinar has been very helpful. I've already dropped our CEO, Jana, with some wisdom of nuggets.
Oh, she should know all of this.
It's still
we used
interesting.
To work together.
I know that. We've got another question, which is, what is your ideal iteration length?
Oh, wow, that's a great question. And I'm going to play the typical consultant and product manager answer. It depends.
It depends. Absolutely.
It depends. personally struggle if it's more than 2 weeks. I don't see why it would need to be longer than 2 weeks, and the reason why it might be longer is to do with deployment capabilities. If you're there's two iteration cycles that really are going on. If I like product teams to think of everything they do as an experiment. So every release is an experiment, and we would tie some criteria to that with an experiment design for every single release. In my last job where I was chief product officer at TES, I mean, we did 28,000 code releases in a year, something like that. So we were releasing lots of times every day. There were a lot of engineers though. So we fixed the problem. There was no pipeline issue. So we were very happy to release quickly. In that case, in those examples, we were releasing code as an experiment on a weekly basis, if not faster. So we were iterating weekly there. At the same time, though, going on is the codeless experiments, which is a different iteration cycle, especially if you kind of adopt a dual track mentality. Those experiments where it might be a customer interview or a prototype, there's no excuse ever for that to be shorter than a week. I mean, it takes, you can build a prototype good enough to test an idea and prove it to fulfill an experiment, something you're truly going to throw away, some clickable prototype, and show it a bunch of users and go through it, walk through. You can do that in a 48-hour window. So there is no excuse for it to be less than 1 week. The bigger issue is the cognitive ability to understand the results, make a good decision of them, and understand and pick the right thing to experiment with in the first place, which is why I would say a week rather than a shorter time. But we've run workshops where we spent 2 days working out a bunch of things to experiment, and then 3 days running 10 or more experiments, and then the week after evaluating all the data. So weekly basis is my preference. On the codeless experiment side, a good tip, something that might help you, is which I've done when I ran teams, and we've helped other teams do, is to set up a situation where you have customers available for testing and talking to, probably over Zoom, on a weekly basis. We used to make it test Thursday. Every Thursday, I'd given somebody the task of more of an operational role, making sure that there were 5 customers to test with every single Thursday. And then product have the challenge of having to do something with these customers. And to begin with, it scares the team to death, and all the product managers are worried and what on earth, they've got nothing to talk about. But 3 or 4 weeks later, they've got into the swing, and they're talking to the customer very regularly every week with something interesting. And if you really are stuck and have nothing to demo or no prototype or no experiment, then just do a general cognitive test with your UXer and your existing product and learn something new, or do a cognitive test of your competitor's product and learn something about them. So you can always fill that time. Hopefully that helps.
Thank you so much. Before we wrap this up, we do have one last question, which I find really interesting, which is, beyond focusing on outcomes over outputs, any tips for mature teams that are looking to break free from the feature factory trap?
Oh, read Melissa Perry's book. That would be a good thing.
Absolutely.
Without a doubt, it's a great book. Other than focusing on outcome, how to stop the feature factory trap. It's a good question. I mean, immediately I want to think about the results instead, and that's just outcome. I think I'm trying to think of an example where I've seen this. You're going to have to change the status quo and get everybody on board that you're doing the wrong thing. And as a mature team, that's harder. It's probably the challenge is less about should we do something instead of outcome focus, because I don't think you should. But the challenge will be, how do I get there? And that's a change management issue. And being a mature team, that's harder, much harder. So I would start with increasing the cadence you do retrospective, and getting somebody to help facilitate retrospective that's not in the team, and asking them to really push you as a team to evaluate the value you're creating and the speed you're creating it. And then finally, waste. I guess that's one way you could do it. You could switch completely and think about more like a Six Sigma approach, sort of more traditional lean manufacturing approach, and think about what's the waste we're creating, how much waste do we have. It'll end up being outcome based eventually, but if you focus on waste, then that will help you stop. When you recognize the waste you're actually creating, the mature team will recognize and understand the problems, and you'll be able to find solutions as a team to change your processes to reduce the waste.
Fantastic. I think that is it then. Thank you everyone for attending. Thank you, Dave, for sitting with us for the last hour, even though you're sick. We really appreciate it. I do hope you feel better soon. For everyone that's here, we will be sending out the recording next week. So if you want to share it with your teams, or watch it again for any tips, you will be able to do that. Thanks again, Dave, and see you guys on our next webinar.
Great. Thanks, everyone. Bye now.